Welcome to Funny, They Don't Look Jewish, where Judaism appears in the panels. Our purpose is to find characters, stories, and issues of comics that explore explicitly Jewish content. I'm Henry Bernstein.
And I'm Brandon Bernstein. No relation.
Previously on Funny They Don't Look Jewish, Brandon and Henry wrapped up the Moon Knight story, featuring the villainous Zohar. In this episode, we'll be jumping ahead a number of years and issues to Moon Knight 194. Take a listen.
We're going to jump forward, everybody, from 1984 to 2018. Just last year, or maybe even 2 years ago, depending on when you listen to this. Henry, why don't you tell us about the details of this issue?
Sure. This is Moon Knight Volume 1, number 194.
Right. So just to explain that really quick, Moon Knight had multiple volumes, I think up to volume 7 or 8 or something like that, many different series. And in 2018, I believe, Marvel started something known as Marvel Legacy, where basically it went back to the original numbering for every comic it had. So you may recall this with the Fantastic Four issue we had that was both issue 5 and also issue 600. Basically, it went back to what numbering would a series be at if every relaunched volume was just a continuation. So all the various Moon Knight series added up to 180 something, and in the legacy numbering, Moon Knight started again in the 180s, and now we're at issue number 194. It might technically be volume 8 or volume 9, but they're considering it, this is number 194 of volume 1, where it's just ongoing continued numbering.
Got it. So, this is Moon Knight, Volume 1, number 194, published June of 2018, released April 25th, 2018. The story is called Moon Knight Origin. Writer Max Bemis, penciler and inker Ty Templeton, colorist Kieran Smith, letterer Corey Pettit, editor Jake Thomas and Mark Basso.
With a gorgeous cover by Becky Cloonan.
Love Becky Cloonan.
She's great. So if that name Max Bemis is familiar to you, it may be because you, like I, were a fan of pop punk in the mid-aughts. There is an incredible band called Say Anything out of the LA area, of which Max Bemis is the lead singer and an incredibly vocally Jewish member. In the third album that Say Anything released, entitled In Defense of the Genre, they had 2 songs with references to Judaism. One song was titled Died a Jew, and the other song is Shiksa, parentheses, girlfriend. So very clearly they're playing with it. But of course, Say Anything is perhaps most famous for an incredible song on their second album entitled Alive with the Glory of Love, which is actually a song about a romance during the Holocaust that is loosely based on the story of his maternal grandparents and how they met. His maternal grandfather, I believe, rescued his grandmother from the camps and they fell in love, and he wrote this story about 2 Jews hiding from the Nazis and basically screwing the day away with each other. It's an incredible song. Alive with the Glory of Love. Go listen to it if you'd like to.
Watch you, wanna do you, right where you're standing. Yeah, right on the foyer, on this dark day, right in plain view. Oh yeah, of the whole ghetto, the rooftop meadows, but we ignore that. Yeah, you're lonely, baby. This war is crazy. I won't let you down.
So Max Bemis is in this band, and he starts writing comic books, and he actually wrote a very critically acclaimed X-Men series that I still haven't read. It's on my list to read, called X-Men, I think, Worst Hero Ever, Worst Hero Ever. Anyway, he ends up taking over Moon Knight as part of Marvel Legacy, and as we'll see, he brings some deeply Jewish themes to this issue.
He says he has what he calls a New Age metaphysical view about religion, and he considers himself a Jew who is also a Christian. And he's identified as Jewish in various online forums and things like that. So he kind of plays with religion in a funny way, as you mentioned, through his music, but also through writing comics.
Right.
He's just sort of seems to be sort of in on the joke, so
Yes.
to speak.
I actually,
with himself.
I went to college in California, and I remember somebody I went to college with commenting how they're like, "Oh yeah, I knew Max Bemis back in day school." So I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
I think it was a day school.
Yeah, he said he was raised in a, quote, strong Jewish environment, which has influenced his music. And as you mentioned, the grandparents, the Holocaust thing.
I want to put out a slight warning. This is one of the most disturbing stories that I think I've ever read. It has some incredibly beautiful, amazing moments, and also Jewish trauma to an insane degree. So if you think that might make you uncomfortable, maybe don't listen to the rest of the episode. We start off with a conversation between Mark Spector and his good friend Frenchie. Now, at this point, Mark has found out that his cabbie identity, Jake Lockley, ended up getting Marlene pregnant, and he has a young daughter that he didn't know about, and he's thinking about what it would be like to have a simple life with Marlene and with his daughter.
Were they estranged? Were they broken
They were,
up?
yeah, they were estranged for a while. And Frenchie's basically like, oh, imagine if you just had some other job, you could just live a life without fear, essentially. And Mark reflects, well, to not have a life of fear and never be scared, I'd need a whole new childhood. And Frenchie's like, why is that? He goes, because I'd need a childhood. Essentially, he says he'd need a childhood of not being Jewish, which strikes you immediately. It's like, wait, what's he saying? Why is this? And then we get a flashback to Mark's childhood. Page 2, we see a flashback to Rabbi Yitz Perlman, who Mark declares was the funniest guy he ever knew. We have this picture of mostly Orthodox Jews, many with payos, many wearing black hats.
Yeah, these are really religious Jews. I mean, these are Hasidic or, I mean, they're
Haredi Jews.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
so that was not clear in the previous issues.
I would say that his father struck me as not even necessarily modern Orthodox, but Orthodox. I mean, we're talking
old
skunky
country
Orthodox. Yeah. So you see all these guys sitting around a table, clearly with wine. It almost looks like they're having a tish, right? And basically, Rabbi Yitz Perlman gives this joke that, well, I guess I'll just read the whole thing. So this man comes to God and he says, "They, Lord, I gave my son the most expensive bar mitzvah. I gave him everything he ever wanted, made him feel like the center of the universe. And after all that, he comes home on Shabbat and he says, 'Dad, I'm becoming a Christian. I feel like a failure. Adonai, what do I do?' So the Lord shakes his head kind of lackadaisically and he says, 'Funny you should come to me with this problem.'" I've heard a variation of this joke. It's cute. It's funny. You see the other rabbis, or the other Jews, erupting in laughter as Mark reflects that there was something exotic and beautiful about the Yiddish inflection that Yitz had.
This is a very different style of writing than Zelenet's.
Totally.
Like,
Using Adonai and just writing it out in that way. It's a different Jewish take.
Yeah.
And, there's also 3 decades between the publication of one and the other.
It's fair. I'm just saying, like, right away, I'm like, this is different than what I just read.
Yes, completely. Page 3, Mark reflects, there's nothing Jews find funnier than making fun of ourselves. And we see a young Mark in a white kippah watching TV. And what's he watching, Henry?
My favorite episode of Seinfeld. One of them.
Anyway, I wanted to talk to you about Dr. Watley. I have a suspicion that he's converted to Judaism purely for the jokes.
And this offends you as a Jewish person?
No, it offends me as a comedian.
It's like one of the all-time great Seinfeld moments. I love that he's watching Seinfeld.
Right, which that's the Judaism that both Mark has, and I also think
He's wearing a kippah while watching Seinfeld.
right.
It's
But
so
I
Jewish.
very much think this is some of Max Bemis's own feelings also coming through as he sort of talks about giving up on organized religion and reflects that he thinks part of the reason Jews like making fun of themselves is a weird byproduct of our pride in being God's chosen people, or at least according to the Old Testament. Like we can afford to take the piss out of ourselves because in the end, we're going to be the ones ruling the roost, which enters some of the uncomfortable nature of chosen people theology and what that means. The fact that Max writes, according to the Old Testament, clearly either reflects, most Jews would call it the Hebrew Bible, they would call it Tanakh, they wouldn't say Old Testament, but if Max indeed describes himself as Jewish and Christian, that makes a bit more sense. We have this incredible image of Moses holding the tablets, about to break them after the golden calf incident, and in front of that you see Moon Knight just giving a thumbs up. It made me flash to Dogma and the Buddy Christ, right?
Yeah. It also reminded me, it was like very like Deadpool-esque, like because like he's sort of looking at the camera, you know, and it's a very like Charlton Heston image of Moses, and he's just sort of in front of it, like look at this guy. And then in the middle, what's that picture in the middle?
We have
so cool.
We have Henry. This might be my favorite Jewish panel ever. In fact, you may recall back when this podcast was just an idea that we sort of each came to, this was the issue that made me want to do this more than anything. There is an image of Moon Knight in a moonlit New York City on a rooftop, crouched on a gargoyle, in full superhero costume, but he's also wearing a black hat, not a Strymel, because it's not fur, but a sort of fedora-like black hat. He has payas coming out of his hood, and he is wearing his cape, except instead of the cape connecting around his neck, as most capes do, the cape turns into a tallis, and he has talitot at the front. This is the most Jewish-looking superhero. It's incredible. I find the image so striking and beautiful. And it's just like,
we got to make this into a T-shirt.
Yeah, it's incredible. We'll obviously put it up. So Mark reflects that he mostly connects to Judaism through the pithy humor. That's what he loves the most. And he says, Yitz was the rabbi who taught my dad how to be one himself, so he was very much an uncle to me. I loved sitting in the corner of his office and listening to Yitz's dad and their friends rant about endless Jewish minutiae and debate its moral significance. And then we have another incredible panel in the bottom right where Yitz is sitting at his desk with the book open in front of him. Another guy, I think Mark's father, Rabbi Spector, in the chair across from him. 3 other Yids at another end, some sitting, some standing, all engaged in a debate. There's, again, a scroll behind them of some sort. And then over in the corner, you see Mark sitting at what looks like a stender doing his homework. And the debate, basically Mark's father says, years in slavery in Egypt, a tragedy. How can you answer otherwise? Someone else responds, the Shoah was also a tragedy, but without it we wouldn't have our own state. And then Yitz, in a bit of foreshadowing, always with the Shoah, right? Someone who's like exasperated by it. And I can certainly understand being in the Jewish world and sometimes feeling like the Shoah takes up a lot of mental space and a lot of energy for very different reasons than Yitz does, as we'll reveal. The next couple pages basically has Mark wandering around and going to his father and asking what the Shoah is, which is pretty incredible.
How old is Mark supposed to be here, do you think?
I'd say no older than 10.
Okay.
He describes himself as prepubescent.
Okay. If he is only in Jewish day school, or literally yeshiva, or cheder, and he's 10... He would know.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about, Henry. Is
I remember
when did you first learn about the Shoah?
As I remember, Yom HaShoah in preschool at Akiva Schechter.
Wow.
Yeah.
And
I don't remember it like, I didn't have nightmares from it. It was just a part of the Jewish experience,
right?
In the way that we had a day where a Purim day or Yom Ha'atzmaut Day, because it was Jewish day school or whatever. There was, on Yom HaShoah, the whole day was that, and that was even preschool, kindergarten. Maybe not preschool, it was our whole day, but we definitely went through whatever exhibit or something the older students put on. Way, way back. My parents didn't spend a ton of time talking about it because we didn't have survivors, only in the context of whatever I learned in school.
Right.
And we didn't have survivors in our family, really, because mostly everyone in our family came over before, but you would definitely, if you were in Orthodox Jewish day school, you know about the Shoah long before, your bar mitzvah.
Right. So the earliest memory I have is in 6th grade when I was 11 years old. I remember us being assigned to read a book called Number the Stars. Mm-hmm. And I remember getting assigned it, and I remember knowing about the Holocaust already because other people in the class were like, "Oh, Brandon, did you know about?" Like, so I knew about it from earlier than that, but I don't remember when I learned about it. So I think for me, going to public school, probably 9 or 10 was around the age when I did learn about it. So this didn't strike me as too weird. But anyway,
But maybe Max Bemis went to public school and
didn't
or whatever.
Right.
I mean,
So-
and definitely there is a thing, especially now, so in 2018, maybe this is more realistic, of like being, well, first of all, not enough people in public schools, period, are learning about the Holocaust. There's all sorts of
100%,
statistics about
yeah.
people who know nothing about it. But also, there is a sensitivity now about teaching this kind of stuff to younger children, just because of like trauma and scaring them,
Right.
and stuff like that. I have my own feelings about that. Like, it's probably just because of the way I was brought up.
Right.
But I mean, I remember working. I was working in a synagogue, and we were putting on a play of Purim for the preschoolers, and they asked me to be Haman, of course, and they didn't give me a script. They're just like, just riff, just do the story with everyone else. And so like, I was like saying something like, "I'm going to kill all the Jews" or whatever, and like the other preschool teachers like, no, you can't. I was like, "Well, what do you tell them?" They're like, "Oh, we just tell them Haman wanted to send them away," and I was mortified. I was like, "What?" And later it was like, well, because the kids go home and have nightmares, and then they tell their parents that at school they learned that a man was going to kill them, and all I could think was, yeah. So I mean, that's what I learned in preschool too. So times they are changing,
Right, they are. Well, in this case, we have clearly Rabbi Spector is uncertain about what's the right age at which to tell his son.
Yeah.
They go back and forth. There's a funny joke about, you said you were old enough when I gave you the sex talk, etc. And after Rabbi Spector...
I definitely learned about the Holocaust before I learned about sex.
Yes, me too.
My parents still haven't told me about sex.
Fair enough. You should probably ask him. You're a married man. So Rabbi Spector basically describes the show as being part of World War II, and in the middle of the describing it, he then just starts sort of zoning out, and we learn that clearly he's a traumatized man who has these flashbacks, these moments of sort of staring out. And on the next page, Mark is once again studying in Rabbi Yitz's office. They're joking back and forth. Yitz throws a crumpled up paper ball at him. And Mark is basically like, "Oh, can I come over and study again tomorrow?" And Yitz says, "Of course, Bitzele, come by after 7. So we get a couple pages of Mark sort of getting ready to go down there. On page 7, Mark's eager to hang and goes by early. So he goes searching through the synagogue basement because the rabbi's office is closed, finds a dusty menorah, but he also ends up finding a floor hatch that leads down somewhere, and young Mark is curious and decides to open the floor hatch. He falls down the hatch, and Yitz approaches him in a very creepy manner, backlit in this very disturbing way, chiding Mark, saying, "I told you not until after 7. Makes Mark promise not to scream and he'll tell him the truth. Strikes a match and lights it, and suddenly in the light you can see that there is a bleeding and beaten body hanging upside down from the roof in chains, as Rabbi Yitz Perlman reveals in what must be the most shocking and horrifying thing you can imagine, that his real name is Ernst. And then he leans up next to Mark, who's crouched on the ground, and says, "A rabbi, a Nazi, and a serial killer walk into a bar." At which point that Yitz reveals that he's actually a Nazi. He was a Nazi who met Mark's grandfather, that Mark's grandfather offered false information in an attempt to buy secure, safe passage for his family to get out of Czechoslovakia, out of Europe, that Ernst knew Hitler would ultimately lose, and so decided to use this Jew, Mark's grandfather, as a way to get out, became friends with Grandpa Spector. They made plans that he would pretend to be Jewish, pretend to be Mark's grandfather's friend who was a rabbi. Ernst then reveals that once there was sort of secure knowledge of this rabbi friend, that he killed Mark's grandfather so that no one could know the truth, and took up his pretend life pretending to be a Jew, pretending to be a rabbi. And that thought of a Nazi escaping by pretending to be a Jew is just like, skin crawling. My skin crawls when I read this. It's horrific. He then reveals that in the Marvel Universe, many Nazis ended up getting superpowers like the Red Skull and the Hate Monger, etc. And he also has a power enhancement. Somehow, Ernst has exceptionally long life, the only cost of it being that he has to stimulate the dark primordial pleasure center of his brain. And as he says to Mark, and as you can see, what I enjoy most is killing Jews. Basically a man pretending to be a rabbi who, on a weekly, monthly, we don't know how often basis, finds a young Jewish boy and tortures and kills him in order to keep himself alive. It's grotesque, it's horrifying, and it really is a nightmare. Perhaps not as big a nightmare as what he then says at the bottom of page 13, and this is very clearly Max Bemis speaking through Ernst. But none of this should frighten you more than what we accomplished together as a nation less than a century ago. In other words, the Holocaust, the real thing that happened, is far more terrifying than this fiction that we are reading. The fact that he's doing this should not be as scary as what happened less than a century ago, what the German nation accomplished. And he then says, I will tell you of your Shoah. And then we have a series of panels showing Mark living his life with Marlene and with his daughter. They're cuddling together. They're taking a walk through the park. They're stargazing from a fire escape out in New York City. Mark and Marlene are making love and cuddling in bed. And over all this domestic bliss, Ernst continues. Do you want to read this for us, Henry? Or would you
Okay.
prefer me to? I can if you'd prefer.
No, I'll do it.
I think we have to read all of it.
Yeah, this is over each panel of all the things Brandon's saying. This is the voice of Ernst. I'm not going to do a German voice or anything. I'm just going to read it. What is referred to as the Holocaust was the organized murder of approximately 6 million Jewish human beings. Imagine that it became the law for you and your family to die. Imagine it happening to you now. First the police come and take your friends and family, put you on trains so full of people you can't move or breathe. No privacy, no dignity. For a while you're confined to a fenced-off ghetto with no knowledge of what's to come until you're taken to the camps where we take you to die. The mothers, sisters, babies, and little girls go first, the ones you want to protect most. They cry and wail and sing the saddest songs. Into the chambers they go, where they slowly choke to death from the fumes, their insides breaking apart at a cellular level. You wake up to find your loved ones missing, to find out they've been shot in the back of the head or thrown in a ditch to rot openly like they're nothing. Since you're a boy, you might make it long enough to be put to work, shifting boulders meaninglessly, knowing eventually you will die and you'll never see your father, the good rabbi, again. Or you might be lucky enough to meet one of the more eclectic officers like myself, or the Dr. Mengele, the one who liked to cut and pry and stitch. It's the same world now that let it happen back then, Mark. It isn't crazy enough that it's impossible. People like me will always be out there waiting to come back for you.
This is every Jewish fear and anxiety put to word on the page. It's clearly Max's anxieties and also just like terrifying. And I'm both disturbed by it and also like, it's kind of amazing that you have a supervillain, torturing this person and saying like, this fictional thing is not nearly as scary as what really happened. And it's
very meta.
It's almost like Max Bemis took a moment to be like, I need to actually do my part to educate people about the Holocaust. Right. Oh, you want to know what the Shoah is?
Right.
This is what the Shoah is, right? Like, this is a level of detail I imagine, God willing, you did not hear as a preschooler, Henry, right? Like it's terrifying and horrifying, and also like has me wondering, would this be an effective comic to use to teach the Holocaust?
Yeah, so I don't know if you noticed, but as you were going through the reveal, I was like shaking my head and shaking my head and shaking my head. And the reason why is because I hated this. Not because I was offended by it or it freaked me out. I mean, it did, but I just thought it was kind of like lame and unrealistic that it didn't make I don't it doesn't add up to me that this guy would pose as a Jewish rabbi and make jokes and learn to become a Talmud Chacham with and hang out with Jews all the time and have payas and then at the same time hate them and kill them, and like I don't know.
But
I understand secret identities. I get it, but like to me, I was just kind of like, oh, come on.
Isn't it an inversion though of some Jews that like to protect themselves pretended to be non-Jews, and sometimes that might have meant being Nazi sympathizers at the very least?
But wasn't that to save their lives?
Yeah, and this is what he's doing to quote unquote save his life.
Oh, because he's prolonging his life, right?
Right.
But like.
I
Do you understand what I'm saying?
I completely understand.
It just doesn't seem like the Zohar as a villain seems more like I can understand that in the world of Kabbalah that could be real to people.
Right.
I don't believe in magic or anything
Right.
like that, but I understand it as a concept.
I think that while Zohar is a believable supervillain, I think that Ernst here is sort of an acid-fueled nightmare. I don't think he's meant to make logical sense, because you're right, it's so baffling. It's nightmare logic. What's the most traumatic thing you could possibly imagine? Is that the rabbi that you looked to for affection and guidance is secretly a Nazi, right?
Yeah.
And, I don't think it's trying to get into levels of, Jews now, like I don't think it's trying to get into like Jews as Nazis. I don't think it's trying to make that political statement. I think it's just sort of again. I think it's the nightmare fueled anxiety of what if the people you look to were actually secretly Nazis, right? It's pure nightmare brought to life, pure anxiety. And I am blessed for the most part, Henry, that among the many struggles I have, and I do have my struggles in day-to-day life, anxiety is not one that I have to deal with. But I know there's lots, I'm thinking of like Shalom Auslander as a writer who constantly is dealing with this Jewish anxiety and the way that his ultra-Orthodox upbringing sort of messed him up and the things he's afraid of. And he's also written a very funny short story called Holocaust Tips for Kids, right? That's all about sort of the constant, he can't stop thinking about what if it happens again. Right. And I feel like this is Max Bemis, who in his songs and in interviews has been very open about sort of his anxiety and his mental struggles and his issues. Like, it just feels like this is the kind of thing that came out of his brain as like a horrific nightmare. And again, it's not logical, it's just terrifying.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, the Holocaust is definitely something that I probably think about at a minimum of once a day. Like it's in the fabric of my Judaism as much as anything else. I'm not like terrified at it. I do have anxiety, but not from that. And I very proudly have 2 lit up menorahs in our window, Chanukias in our window, Bemis is up. But I am also afraid that the Nazis are going to come, at some point. But with this, it just felt, and I'm having trouble articulating what would have been a better choice in like what I would have liked better to see in terms of like I don't know. I think it would have been maybe it would have been better if this had just been a telling of this relationship with this rabbi, and then something tragic happened to him where a Nazi serial killer killed him, and then Mark Spector has motivation to go after him or something like that. Maybe it wouldn't have been as effective in that one panel where he's explaining the Holocaust over the scene of him, because explaining the Holocaust from that perspective it was scary. But I don't know, it just kind of felt like I don't know. I didn't like it.
That's fair. I mean,
you know what I want to say about it? It's like I didn't like it, and I'm wondering whether it's for your listeners out there. May know Brandon and I are big wrestling fans. So one of the core concepts of wrestling is good versus evil, heel versus babyface versus heel. And the effectiveness of a heel, a bad guy, is if you boo them, if you don't like them. And the second they start becoming kind of cool and you like them, they're not really doing their job as a heel. And so I'm wondering if I don't like this because it's effective, heel work, like this is a really good villain, or if I don't like it because of all the things I said about why I don't like it.
Right.
Did you find it effective?
You know, so let's just finish up really quick.
Okay.
No. I want to say Mark fights back. He escapes. He runs away. He never sees Ernst again. Gets transfers to another synagogue. We'll get back to that, but I want to bring it up because basically what Max Bemis is doing is setting up Ernst to be a major villain for the rest of his Moon Knight run.
Right.
And unfortunately, while Ernst does return, the Jewish themes don't really. They don't really come back. So I guess it's effective.
Then what was the point?
It's effective in sort of bringing up a villain that Mark can have a personal connection to, right, in that sort of way. I don't know why, but for whatever reason, this story just strikes me as Max Bemis wanted a chance to work out some of his Jewish trauma on the comic book page, and he had a Jewish superhero he was writing, and this was the Jewish issue that he had, and a chance to sort of work it out. It almost strikes me as, again, I think the language that he used was like so scary and so terrifying that it's sort of, I'm a fan of Holocaust education that points out what happened without diving into histrionics and going a little bit too, without diving into scare tactics, and this felt like it crossed the line into sort of scare tactics. But on the other hand, when you're talking about an audience of people who maybe aren't as familiar and aren't aware of what it is, it really does feel like this is a moment for him to say, nothing I write is as terrifying as the Holocaust actually was. And he dives into that. And to that degree, does it belong in the superhero comic? I don't know. Is it effective? Maybe. It's not the choice I would have made, but it's certainly memorable. This is certainly a comic book I've never forgotten, and it's one that has remained with me, and it's one that other friends of mine who are Jewish and read comics have told me that they find it disturbing. It maybe reminds me of, I'm a fan of horror movies. I enjoy horror movies, and a lot of my friends hate them and find there are horror movies that they find grotesque and disgusting, and sometimes that's the point, is to kind of put the mirror up to some of the more horrific elements of life sometimes. So, it's somewhat effective. I think the rest of the run shows a lost opportunity, but also it gets a little bit rushed. I feel like he was planning to be on the title longer and then had to suddenly wrap everything up. And so maybe in an alternate world where Max Bemis was on Moon Knight for 20 more issues, we would have seen this drawn out in a more satisfactory way. I'd say as an issue in and of itself, I'm intrigued enough by this, and it's the lack of follow-up that makes it disappointing to me. The last thing I want to bring up is that, as Mark runs away and reflects on the fact he never told anyone about this until right now while he's telling Frenchie, he says, I still remember the last thing he said to me as I left that basement. Don't worry, you'll find a way to live with this. And I thought that was a very powerful line, and it made me wonder, is this Jewish destiny and trauma, this idea that no matter how horrific things, even the most horrific of things, somehow we'll find a way to live with it, because that's what life is always moving forward. And it's like childhood innocence being shattered, right? I think Max Bemis writes this as the reason that Mark developed dissociative identity disorder, as the reason that he had to hide in entirely different identities. Worth noting, I think Mark Spector's Jewish. I don't think his other identities are Jewish, right? Yeah. So worth noting, like, what it means to sort of have this split and this escape. He was trying, I think part of this is trying to find a traumatic event to have in youth that would explain why would he completely leave Judaism behind, and why would he develop other alternative personalities. And in that case, he was sort of hamstrung by what we already knew of Moon Knight and attempting to explain it. Maybe it's effective, but God, like, what a haunting term that no matter how terrifying and horrifying something can get, don't worry, you'll find a way to live with this. Like, my heart just breaks open hearing that.
I guess if I had been a fan of Moon Knight and following Moon Knight for years or whatever, just had read anything, honestly, maybe that would have been a more effective. But because I'm reading, essentially, I think for the purpose of this podcast, I read 5 issues of Moon Knight. It's in a vacuum, and so maybe that's why it just didn't work for me
Yeah.
as well. And this
Yeah.
is also the problem with retconning, is that if you have read previous things, you're wondering, well, why am I just hearing about this now? And obviously, we had a whole conversation about Rise of the Skywalker beforehand, and I don't want to get into spoilers, but we're just hearing about this now? We had a whole thing about his father, the rabbi, and his childhood, and so, whereas you want previous stuff, you want new stuff to build on previous stuff, and obviously retconning is part of comics. You have to do it to write new stories. But it sort of felt like, it was funny, when I saw that this story was going to be called Origin, I was like, oh, I wonder if Moon Knight is that same thing that we see with, I don't think it is, but with Ragman, where they just keep rewriting his origin over and over again. But maybe not, I don't know.
Yeah, it feels like they're opening, Max Bemis certainly went in a different direction of, now that we know this about his father, let's add this other thing about other Jews that were around in this thing.
Is there anything Jewish in the Bendis Moon Knight?
As we saw, there's one panel where at a party you see a man wearing a yarmulke. That's about it. I don't remember there being any Jewish content there. Jeff Lemire wrote an incredible run, no Jewish content. Warren Ellis wrote a stunning run, no Jewish content. Really,
That's
Max? Yeah, Max. Yes, Henry's referencing an old '90s comic we found where Ellis had some not so elegant things to say about Judaism. He's not a writer I want to be writing about Jews. But anyway, that maybe segues into my point, which is, we've talked about this before. So much of explicit Jewish content is actually dependent on the creators. And today we saw two very different creators with very different Judaisms. And ultimately, I'm glad to have the variety. I'm glad that not every Jewish comic book is written by an erudite rabbi like Alan Zelenetz, as much as I enjoyed that. And I really enjoyed getting to see Max Bemis struggle through things on the page. And again, that panel alone of Moon Knight with the tallest cape is just
very cool.
Incredible, amazing. And I think that Moon Knight did a good job of showing us, even though there was a repeat of synagogues being attacked by neo-Nazis, of Holocaust and stuff like that, I feel like we got to explore new elements of Jewish content in these stories, and for that I'm really appreciative. It's been really fun spending some time with Moon Knight, and I'm just pumped for whoever we dive to next, because every character is just surprisingly continues to be a treasure trove.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you for finally introducing me to Moon Knight in this way, instead of just like, here's a bunch of Moon Knight comics. I love Moon Knight, because now I love him.
Right, yeah.
And I feel about him similar to how I did about Ragman. A total, 4 or 5 out of 5 Magid Davids for him. Totally Jewish superhero who I love now. And I think Bemis doesn't feel as mature in his writing in the way that Rabbi Allen does, but clearly a thoughtful writer.
Yes.
And gets the character. And so I appreciated that. But yeah, Moon Knight was fun. This was great.
A lot of fun, and I think the big thing is, as a Moon Knight series approaches, as we mentioned, the big hope is that they have Jewish content in that series. We'll keep our eyes peeled, and you should keep your ears peeled for the next episode that will be coming out, where we're going to be moving into a few more characters that we should be doing, I think one more full episode and then a couple of quick hits before we sort of bring this exploration of characters to a close.
Should we announce who our next one is?
Sure.
All right. Well, we're going to be looking at Sabra,
the Israeli superheroine. Yep, she sounds like a Jewish stereotype of a different sort. We'll get to discover things. I'm really excited to read some of the first appearances of her. But Sabra's what's next, and for right now, I'm Brandon Bernstein.
I'm Henry Bernstein.
No relation.
You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Jewish Comics Pod, and you can email us at jewishcomicspodcast@gmail.com.